Hey everybody. So let's see, today we're going to finish up the last bits of our topic of political geography. And then Friday we're going to meet in the lab, which is just the room right over there. So if you come in here, it'll be quick and easy for you to just go over there. And there's no prep you need to do for this lab. We're just going to do some stuff with maps, and hopefully it will be interesting and just kind of give you an idea of, well, kind of what people do to make all these maps that we've been looking at all semester. It is a profession, map making, and in my opinion, not too tricky, pretty fun, well, relatively fun anyway. Any general questions about anything before I just finish up our political geography topic? Have I talked to y'all about how the original decision came about that, well, what party is red and what party is blue? Did I mention that? See some heads nodding. Well, this section of our reading talks about things that kind of pull apart countries and things that unite countries. And this can involve a lot of different things. In the U.S., there's some divisiveness when it comes to politics. Does that mean it's going to destabilize? Well, I don't have to remind everybody that there was once a civil war and there was once a divided country, and in lots of ways the political divide mimics aspects of that, obviously. But overall, our country has kind of mixed around a lot more since then. And so there's less kind of a geographic boundary to these political differences compared to how they used to be. This here is a bit more of a complicated map because this shows the different colors based on politics, but this one includes some purple, and as you can see, the United States is laid down in places with high populations. The higher the population, the higher the level, right? So it's a nice little gradient map. But this also shows you why, well, very often in big cities, the vote will take a long time, right? Often because they don't have, well, if you go out to a rural area, there'll be voting machines and whatnot. And when you get to urban areas, there are more, but there's not proportionally more compared to how many people there are. There should be, because if that happened, then well, all the voting would be done around the same time, but because of this, things get a backlog every year. Classic political maps. This one is, again, changed for population, because traditionally, we see a lot of maps that are like this, and it's like, well, if you control for population, squishing places that have smaller population, and stretching out things that have larger populations. Looks to me, well, Minnesota seems to be one of the only places that's kind of the same size in both aspects. A couple more similar maps. Again, these ones show you some purple, but again, show you some big population clusters here and there. Just showing you a bit more how diffuse these different voting blocks are. Like I said, if you look at the area that was the South in the Civil War, you can see it's not a monolithic entity, right? Not that it was necessarily completely monolithic entity. Similar divisions happen around the world, similar political divisions. I would say one of the big differences, so for example, in much of Europe, they have more than just two parties, but they also tend to have a structure that allows a larger range of parties, and so you'll get lots of kind of smaller parties that have little different groupings, but as you can see, well, broadly there are geographic regions also when it comes to politics. Well, what are some things that make it difficult for a country to kind of hold itself together? Sometimes that comes down to geography, right? There's lots of different countries around the world that if there are a series of islands, it's very easy for different parts to feel like they're underrepresented, to feel like they're not kind of part of where everything is happening. In Indonesia, for example, the vast majority of the population live here, And so it's always a kind of a matter of the other places feeling like they're properly represented. Or a country like Chile, they're not having a lot of fragmentation issues, but it is, the geography is a very long country, right? And so they kind of have to make, well, special rules and whatnot to make sure everyone's represented. Chile also, though, actually has most of its population is actually a bit more central than the country itself. Russia, being a very, very big country, it's had classically lots of kind of problems keeping itself kind of coherent and together. When things do lead towards civil wars or different types of conflict and whatnot, how do these manifest? Well, you know, we see these things on the news all the time, things like ethnic separatism, things like ethnic cleansing. I got a map here of Myanmar because it's an example where, well, locally here we have a lot of the Karen people who are refugees from this region, and they're being, well, ethnically cleansed by the main ethnicity in the country. But as you can see, the country itself, it has lots of different ethnicities, lots of different groups. But you have one group that basically is in charge of the military, and they're using that power to, well, push out groups that they want to take their resources, want to take their land or whatnot. Kind of a classic thing that happens in lots of places. And so populations are pushed out into neighboring countries where there's refugee camps and things like that. If this conflict, you know, if a number of these other groups kind of got together and there was an internal conflict, you could see hypothetically perhaps a part breaking off, right? And being these groups together kind of depends on how much different countries have a mixture of people or not. Yeah, what we can do now, let's check. I've talked a little bit about kind of Russia, the Soviet Union, the crisis in Ukraine. Russia has been a place that classically, very large place, lots of different types of people. And so historically, in order to kind of, well, keep itself as a coherent, unified country, it's very often had to use force. It has had to use force. And this is back when it was the Soviet Union. It had a very large military that basically kept everyone in line. And then when the Soviet Union fell, well, Russia itself, being mostly what the Soviet Union was, population and by geography, but Russia also has kind of leaned in on the authoritarian side. These are some maps from our book, just showing you basically where the Soviet Union was, and then after the fall of the Soviet Union, a number of the countries that had been basically conquered by Russia at the end of the Second World War. Well, during the Second World War, while Germany was taking over countries and Italy was also taking over countries, Russia was taking over places. And, well, I think I talked about this a bit before, but the identity of all these countries, a big part of their identity is the fact that they were so persecuted during those times. Because basically, central Russia, centered around Moscow, just really wanted to take resources from these places, right? It was very much in line with kind of the same old colonialism that we've talked about many times, where you have kind of a central power that has taken over other countries. When the most recent invasion into Ukraine happened, well, I say the most recent because it was actually like 2014 that Russia took Crimea. And when that happened, there was an amount of international outcry, but, well, during the Soviet era, Russia moved in a bunch of Russian population into a number of regions and all the different countries that they had control of. This is what all empires do. They move in their own people, who are usually their own ethnicity, into countries, into positions of command and control. Positions of command and control. And so Russia had done this. And so since most of the population here were ethnically Russian, although this had not been a part of Russia for many years, a lot of people kind of were like, well, okay, I guess. The more recent invasion, people had been assuming that these areas that are highly Russian were going to be taken over, and well, that would have been one thing, but these are also areas that are primarily Russian heritage, and so there's a mixed feeling about that, but that's not what happened. What happened was Russia invaded over here to the capital, and then when they invaded, they did the same thing that conquering armies do in many different places, which is, well, they would enter a city and they would round up its officials. They would be able to find them through social media, and then basically tell them that they're switching teams, that they're switching to Russia and not Ukraine anymore. And if they said no, they usually took them out and shot them, and then appointed their own people. And all this was very shocking to the world because this is the classic colonialism, empire building thing that, well, many of these countries had suggested they had moved on from, right? And now there's been kind of a continuous fight, and well, in this fight, both sides have had huge major losses, especially Russia. But Russia has moved so authoritarian over the years that they're just sending more and more troops and sending more and more troops, and many of these troops are recruited out of prisons and whatnot, and they're told that they will get their freedom if they fight for Russia. But these are, well, people who are criminals, right? And so these are the people who are kind of on the front lines of different places invading small town Ukraine. During the Cold War era, well, the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, had taken over, well, as you can see, they're not even on the map on this example, a number of these countries, but it also had control over a good amount of Europe itself, right? And these countries would have different kind of mini revolutions that would just be put down, that they would famously kind of send tanks in to put these different things down. When the Soviet Union fell, economically, it was very bad for Russia itself, because Russia and Moscow had been getting all of these resources from not just the areas that were in the USSR, but a whole bunch of other countries that had complete control over. They were basically puppet states where they would install the leadership. They, being Russia, would install leadership of these different countries. After the Soviet Union fell, the economy was so bad that the death rates in Russia skyrocketed, and this wasn't from a conflict. This is from suicide and people drinking themselves to death and things like this. And that had been going on for about 10 years before Putin was elected as president. And he's been president ever since. He's done a number of different things to make it so that, well, when he was president, their presidents, similar to us, had term limits. So what he did was, as president, he made a new office called a prime minister, and he gave all of the power of the presidency to the prime minister, and then he ran for prime minister and won. And that office doesn't have any term limits. So he wants to be president for life, and that could conceivably happen. Even though, like I said, he's going through some major losses. They're losing troops left and right, and unfortunately Ukraine is also. But Ukraine is not at the same rate, because although Russia has a lot of resources, is a big place. Do I got a bigger map of Russia? So they have a lot of area that they could draw resources from. Ukraine is being given resources from many Western developed countries, many countries that were part of the Soviet Union, and they want to basically help an ally who's trying to fight off Russia from retaking that space. This map here shows basically the core and the periphery region of Russia through time and how it expanded through time, right? You had started out as a very small area around Moscow, but through subsequent invasions and taking over areas, and so this whole area had a whole bunch of different types of different ethnicities and religions and cultures, And the closer to the central Moscow region was the area that was more assimilated than the rest of the area. Process called Russification, which is just what empires do. During the Nazi era, there was Germanization, and before it, this is what a lot of empires do, where they have a forced assimilation of territories they take over in order to basically culturally dominate the area. There's something else I was going to add, but I don't remember what it was. Mention heartland theory really quickly. Heartland theory, it's an old theory, but it's a theory that whoever had control of the central landmass of the Eurasian continent would more easily be able to kind of take over the world, because they would have such a heartland of area that could never be fully invaded and taken over. This is one of the reasons why during the Cold War, this is a rationale for containment of the Soviet Union, because there was the feeling that if they wanted to, they could take over everywhere. A big part of Russia's rationale for taking over Ukraine as well as other places is the argument that there are Russians there, and historically it was under control of Russia, and therefore they have a right to do it. This was actually, the same argument that the Germans had during the Nazi era. You had German populations in neighboring countries, and then Hitler would say, oh, they're persecuted, people are being mean to them, we gotta go take over those countries to protect our own people. And so then they would just invade these places and very often kill off the different groups. But there are remnants of past empires all over the map, right? The Mongolian Empire also used to rule huge amounts of this territory. But if Mongolia decided that it was going to retake this area, that would not be coherent to people, right? And so it also doesn't make sense when Russia is trying to do it in our modern day. One of the big reasons that Russia invaded is because, their economy, although it's better than it was right after the Soviet Union fell, it has not been doing well. The birth rate is still lower, and it's in general losing population. People are moving out of the country. It's losing resources. And basically Ukraine is a relatively prosperous place. Ukraine historically, when it trades, it is basically coordinated with Russia, giving Russia a lot of benefits to trade. But through time, it became very clear to Ukraine that trade on the world market would get them a lot more money, right? If they're selling products like wheat or whatever else, if they're just selling to the highest bidder worldwide, as opposed to selling to Russia for whatever Russia says it wants to pay, that's a lot more money. That was money and resources Russia was going to lose, and they decided that, that was a bridge too far. In the past, Russia did a number of different things to try to kind of, to discipline different areas. One of the classic ones that would happen all the time is Russia has a lot of fossil fuel resources, so it has a lot of natural gas, and it supplies a bunch of Western Europe with natural gas, a bunch of Western Europe that don't have much. In the past, politically, if something happened, if Russia wanted to discipline these other areas, it would threaten to cut off supplies, it would threaten to increase how much it would cost to get natural gas. This had happened enough times that countries were leaning toward a lot of different alternatives for energy. France specifically really went for nuclear power. If you travel in France, if you're on a train, you'll go by giant nuclear power plants just kind of like all the time. Germany, oddly enough, although it's a bit of a northern country, it switched to a lot of solar. And surprisingly, it was able to really, really make inroads in its energy use. Most of these countries have, when the invasion of Ukraine started, and you can see how close that Ukraine is to all these other countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union and ruled by the Soviet Union. Most of these countries have now cut off their use of fuel, including someone we don't know who blew up the Nord Stream. That was on the news a lot for a while. There have been a lot of theories about who would have done it. it really only benefits Ukraine. So it could have been Ukraine, but also could have been Russia as a way to discipline the West. So when a country like Russia is facing a crisis within political and economic problems, countries will do things to try to hold everything together. Very often it's to clamp down militaristically. Often it's to take control of the press and publishing. So, for example, there's a more unified front is kind of put forward for people when they're consuming their news. Or national emergencies, right? You could have a national emergency that could be real, or you could have one that's fabricated by that country in an effort to try to unify everyone and get everyone kind of on the same side. Actually, let me go back. I think I missed a point. Did I miss a point? No. Okay. This chapter goes on to talk about larger political entities, supranationalism. After the fall of the Soviet Union, for a time, there was a Commonwealth of Independent States that came about that was coordinating economically, and these involved a number of the countries that were part of the Soviet Union. As I said, that economic coordination, all those countries through time realized that they could make a lot more money if they sold their resources to the world market, right? Especially countries that would have lots of resources that were culturally much more tied to the region they're in than central Moscow. You also have here in purple the European Union. The history of the European Union is talked about a bit in this chapter. In a nutshell, there was a feeling after the Second World War that if there was more economic integration within the region, there would be less likely to maybe be a World War III, right? The feeling was that, well, if every place was developed and if, a country started getting some hostilities toward another country, but if your economy would completely collapse, if there's a war, that's pressure to basically not do that, right? And the European Union has been very successful in lots of different things. One of those things being allowing more free travel and trade in this region, allowing, if you have a business and you want to have a larger market, you could have a market of the whole European Union rather than just your country. Some other organizations on this map, Association of the Southeast Asian Nations. This is actually a trade group that when it first came about, it was mostly about a counterweight to China, and it was very anti-communist, but also very specifically anti-China. Through time, it's had to pivot because when it did this is when China's economy was closed out to the rest of the world, and economically, people just kind of didn't care what was going on in China. Once China opened up and then became an economic powerhouse, then these countries all kind of had to shift their position a bit and kind of work with China. More recently, though, these countries have pivoted away from China again, mostly because since 2020-ish, China's had a lot of economic problems. We talked about already in our population section about how the first time China is having declining population. There's also a thing happening where during the pandemic, a lot of countries moved toward manufacturing independence because a lot of the commodity chains of getting products around the world completely slowed down in the pandemic. And so that economically hurt a lot of those companies. So countries have moved toward, well, what if we just make the things we need locally? And they had to make that switch during the pandemic. And China very much is kind of like, hey, everybody, come back to buying everything from China again. But already the infrastructure and everything is in place to not do that so much. So likely, China will stay in an economic decline for a while, and I don't know necessarily how they'll get out of it. They'll have to rely on things other than manufacturing, that's for sure. But we'll talk about the challenges of that when we get to our chapter on economics. Another group here, the Arab League. This organization came about again to coordinate economic activity primarily, especially since these areas were so unified culturally, it kind of made sense in a lot of ways for it to also unify economically. This is the map from the book, actually, looking at a number of these same regions. What else we got here? We have NATO a bit on this map. NATO, what is NATO? Well, it's in the news a lot these days, mostly because of this conflict in Ukraine. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. NATO came about during the Cold War. Countries came together to basically sign that they would coordinate militaries together, and very specifically, if there was an invasion into any of these NATO countries, saying that all the countries would come together to defend that country. Ukraine is not in NATO, but it is attempting to get in NATO. If Ukraine had been in NATO, this is also, many argue, this is why Putin invaded when he did, because Ukraine was moving toward more integration with Europe, including being in this military alliance. But it wasn't. If it had been, then you would have kind of had World War III. Right now, wouldn't call it World War III because it's more of what we call a proxy war. A proxy war, well, the war in Vietnam was a bit of a proxy war. What that means is you can have an internal conflict within a country or within a region that is like relatively small when you compare it to a world war. But you could have major powers, sometimes called superpowers, who have an interest on each side. And so that country, let's use Vietnam as the example. There was a civil war inside the country. The country itself didn't have a lot of resources, and it was only kind of so much fighting that could be done with the arms and the weapons that they had. But once they were supplied by superpowers, the war was huge, and there was massive deaths compared to what there would have been. And something like that is going on in Ukraine as well. Although the Russian side is only supplied by Russia, as we've established, they have a lot of resources, a lot of territory. And Ukraine is getting armed by many countries of Europe, the US, and so it's kind of like a mini World War III in some ways. Well, when I talk about how big Russia's economy is and how big Russia is, I don't mean to overemphasize it because, as I said, they have not been doing well economically for quite a few years. The economy of Russia, right, this huge area, is smaller than the economy of South Korea, right? And so although they have a lot of resources and they're a big space, well, like I said, they're not doing that well economically. A lot of the armaments that they're sending into Ukraine are stuff that's left over from the Second World War, like old tanks and old equipment. Some of it is kind of exploding when they try to use it. What this stuff here talks about is just where the UN came from. There was a group called the League of Nations beforehand. The League of Nations was pretty much dropped because the purpose of the League of Nations was to make it so that there wouldn't be a World War II, but it really didn't do anything to slow down or stop World War II. So the UN came about afterward. The UN itself, not to be confused with NATO, the UN is it's a worldwide organization, and it has far less resources. It's not really a military organization. It usually does more things to coordinate aid efforts for natural disasters and things like that. Sometimes the UN will send in a peacekeeping force if perhaps you have a country that has a new democracy, and if a small force would kind of keep everyone respectful during the election process, things like that. But it doesn't have a lot of power. One of the main reasons being, although the UN is for all countries to be in, there's 5 countries who have basically all the power, right? And those 5 countries were the countries that were the main kind of winners of the Second World War. That being the United States, right? Britain, France, and China, and also the Soviet Union, which Russia has that seat right now. And so anything that wants to get kind of passed that might be controversial, if any of those 5 countries veto it, then it doesn't happen, right? And so anything involving this conflict, for example, well, Russia can just veto it. Some have suggested, because the seat of the original United Nations was for the Soviet Union, some have suggested that it could technically be switched to a different country that was part of the Soviet Union, say Ukraine, if the UN decided, could just give Ukraine Russia's seat. No one's ever moved forward with that, but technically that would be a legal thing that they could do. All right. Supranational organizations, I actually talked about these two pretty thoroughly. I talked about these ones a bit. I'll give you an example of a project that this type of coordination can do. In the Asian group, well, they coordinated infrastructure projects, even though these countries often have internal fights and conflicts and don't like each other and stuff. They all agreed that they were all benefiting from tourism, and if they connected their main tourist sites with highways, that could benefit all of them. But you take some coordination, because you can't have a highway, in the US, you can't have a highway going to one state that just stops there. And you know what I mean? It's like, well, what's the point of the highway? So it took coordination, but it also had the benefit of the fact that, well, sure, tourists could use these to get to sites, but like all the rest of the population could also use these to get around, right? So it would actually benefit locals as well, which is kind of one of the main things. If you're looking for development, you want something that develops local resources and helps the most people possible. Some more supranational national organizations. The Arctic Council isn't a well-known organization, but it's becoming more and more important, especially as the northern Arctic starts to thaw out, and lots of islands and whatnot that had been frozen in ice are exposed, and areas for looking for more resources, right, are opening up. And so this area is actually becoming more and more contentious. The African Union, I don't have a map of the African Union because that would just be a map of Africa, because the African Union includes all of Africa. And this is, if they keep united, so there's plenty of reasons that it could fragment, but if they keep united, that as a region could be the biggest economy, some 20, 30 years in the future. Because that is still the quickest growing compared to the rest of the world, right? The G20, which is a group of basically the 20th wealthiest countries that get together and kind of coordinate efforts. I believe one seat was offered to the African Union because as a union, well, they're extremely wealthy as that large of an entity. Right, and so then it would therefore qualify to be in that organization. I'm not going to do reflection activity. What are the benefits of supernatural nationalism? I would say another one that our book really doesn't talk about that much is, now it's jumped out of my head. NAFTA. People ever heard of NAFTA? Mm-hmm. NAFTA was very controversial for a while, the North American Free Trade Association. That's just the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And all that did was make it so that trade could be easier across borders. It was controversial because a lot of people figured that what would happen would be a lot of jobs, including manufacturing jobs, would just be moved south of the border. And that did happen for a large amount of time. You had a lot of industry that located there, but actually, well, like I said, you had protests and people who are kind of like anti-globalization activists, but by the time anyone kind of came together with any kind of coherent strategy, those jobs had already left Mexico and gone all the way over to China. So the geography moved enough that people just kind of don't care about NAFTA. For a while, there was a feeling, well, there are a lot of people who are like, oh, this larger organization is going to rule our lives. That's not what I want. I want my country to be my country and not this larger group. But they had assumed that there would be like a North American dollar and a lot more coordination in North America, similar to what Europe has done. Europe is coordinated by all adopting the same currency. This has been, as a traveler, this has made it a lot easier to travel because historically, when I've gone, anytime you cross a little tiny border, any cash that you have in the other currency, you have to get rid of, you have to convert to all new currency, figure out how much things are worth, a whole kind of laborious process. Having one currency just made it a lot easier. It also made it so that that currency that they had was a lot more stable, because there's a lot more countries involved in it, right? The European Union coordinates a lot of stuff. Now this map shows the UK and the kind of the Brexit argument. When I say that, although this area is like a European Union and it's very united in lots of ways, there of course are culturally lots of different areas and culturally lots of reasons for it to fragment and pull apart, right? So far, what's been happening overall is you've had actually a lot of people just kind of move around, similar to the US, where people will move looking for the best work they could be, or maybe they don't like the climate where they live, stuff like that. And so as that has happened, like if you travel these countries, you're on the ground, if you go to Paris, you'll have people from all over Europe who are just Parisians and who live there. A lot of people from around the world as well. But it being kind of this unified economic entity, although you do have these differences in these areas, and you have areas that want to be separatist and stuff, but the Basque, they don't want to be separatists from the European Union. They want to be separatists from Spain. A lot of these pressures to fragment and separate are not from the larger groupings, they're from the smaller ones. I'm not going to debate. When it comes to things that are uniting countries, this chapter talks about Germany and German history a bit. Germany is, one of those places that people kind of have this thing in their mind of this kind of one unified culture. But all of Europe used to be a bunch of little empires, a bunch of little kingdoms, and they had their own cultures and their own languages. And it was only through a long process of assimilation of you'd have one dominant ethnicity that would basically go in and force everyone else to convert to those cultural norms through time. And that's how the modern kind of Germany as we know it came about. Now, if you're traveling in Germany and you go to these areas, the architecture you'll still notice is different and unique and a number of the customs, but a lot of the stuff was lost, especially areas that were Prussia. Those areas were very specifically forced to assimilate. And when I say that, what I mean is, like they would have rules saying, Prussian national anthem, no one can ever sing it. If you do, you'll be in jail, right? If you use any cultural norms that are Prussian, that was oppressed, right? And that's how through time created this kind of cohesive, something that people think of as an ethno-state, like a state that has one ethnicity, when historically that wasn't the case. That was something that was very kind of forced on the populations. I'm not going to reflect. Kind of mentioned this at the start, things that divide countries and whatnot. So the Brexit vote was geographically very uneven. As you can see, there were large areas, and the vote was very close, but large areas that did not want to leave the European Union, right? And because of that, and because the vote itself was a bit of a surprise, because it was very close, and it went the way people had assumed it would not. So a lot of people who wanted the UK to stay in the European Union, a lot of them didn't vote because they assumed that the vote would go their way. The UK did, in fact, it took years, but they did, in fact, leave the European Union. But they made all kinds of other treaties and whatnot with the European continent and the European Union itself, so that it kind of gets a lot of the benefits of being in the European Union without a lot of the downsides. Some downsides being, I mentioned this a little bit before, a disadvantage of these larger organizations is an inability to react quickly to shocks. So in the Great Recession, when the world had a big recession, well, the US conveniently had an election right after and got a new president who came in saying he wanted to do a bunch of stuff, and then he just did that stuff. And things turned around in the US more quickly than they did in Europe, because Europe, they had a larger bank and there was disagreement among countries what to do. And so basically nothing was done for a long time as the economy just kind of sunk. And ever since then, places, especially Britain, have decided that they need to have more control over their economies rather than having a large other organization controlling their economies. Some specifics about Brexit. I'm trying to see if there's something that I missed in talking about it. I guess I would say I didn't talk about immigration levels. In the rest of Europe, when countries become part of the European Union, it frees up travel, but it also frees up more immigration. And the UK being a very prosperous country, it was worried that populations from all of the rest of the European Union would start moving there and would drive up prices even more and make things more expensive for people who are living in the UK, in a country that's already pretty expensive. It's already pretty expensive. I think that's the only other thing that I didn't mention for that. Bunch of self-assessments. All right, should be plenty of time for a couple political questions. I'm getting deja vu, but I don't think I made you guys answer these ones before. So we'll see.